Okay, so I want to just do a little video here about how to properly solder wires together. So there's a number of ways to connect wires together. Butt connectors are very common. So you'd strip a little bit off and crimp them. They're really a poor connection. They're quick, that's why people like them, but they're just a spot where moisture can get in and create corrosion, dirt and dust can get in and things like that. So they're not a really great connection. So we're going to do a proper solder and heat shrink here, which is by far superior. So I want to talk a little bit about stripping wires. Now it's just more important for you to see my hands and my talking, so I'll get set up here so you can see. So we want to take and strip some of the casing off of the wire. Now you can see that the wire strippers have numbers on them, so it tells you what gauge of wire would fit into which spot on the strippers. And so this is a 16 gauge wire, so we would use the 16 gauge stripper. Now if we're not too sure what the gauge is, what you want to do is just start big. Okay, that doesn't work, and work your way down. So the risk is when you take and start too small, and what happens is you actually cut the copper wires right here where you stripped. And what you've done then is you've changed the gauge of that wire in this one spot. And wire is like a chain, right? So it becomes, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And so what happens is you've cut some of that wire there, you've now changed the gauge and made this a smaller wire. So that little spot can't handle as much current. It can get hot and melt and burn in that one little spot. Even though you've got proper gauge here and a proper solder over here, you've cut wire here. So you've just got to be careful with that. Okay, so now we're going to look at a butt splice. So for a butt splice, we're trying to put two wires together like this. So we want to lay them at about a 45 and twist them together. Now we call this a mechanical connection, and that's honestly probably the first and most important thing of your solder joint, is to make a really good strong mechanical connection. Okay, so we want to twist it in there with some pretty good force. Now if you get into a gauge like about 12 gauge or 10 or 8, you get to a point where you can't twist them anymore, and that's where I will use an uninsulated butt connector, which is just the connector without the plastic, and I'll actually crimp them and then fill that with solder and then put heat shrink on it. But the smaller gauges of wire we can twist pretty easily and get a nice connection like that. Okay, so now we want to take and solder it. So what solder is doing for us, let's get this heat gun going here, or solder gun, sorry. Doesn't want to light. There we go. Okay, so that's heating up there. Well, we let that heat up. We'll talk a little bit about what solder does. So solder is an alloy. Tin and lead was what it used to be, and now with the toxicity of lead, that's mostly tin and copper. And so it has a lower melting point than the copper, but what happens is we're kind of melting it in and around the copper, and we're just getting a little bit of melting on the copper, where this can kind of melt and fuse together in there. So we want to actually draw this solder into the copper. We don't want to just melt it and puddle it on top like a glue gun per se. Okay? Now, solder does attract to itself. It's similar to water and those types of liquids, where, you know, if you have two droplets of water on a windshield, you'll see them sort of come together and suck together. And solder has those same properties, right? So if we just got this super hot, this copper here, and just tried to melt it, it would melt it, but it doesn't draw in as well. So if we can kind of draw it to itself, it works really good. So I'm going to try and do this on the camera side here. Hopefully you can see. Now I'm going to take and do what I call feeding the crack. So what I'm doing is I'm feeding this little spot between the soldering gun and the wire, and I'm creating that sort of puddle where it's going to draw to itself. And then I kind of bring my solder up to the top and I start to draw it in. So you can see that I'm drawing the solder in already, and I haven't got this copper super hot yet. If you don't do that, your copper ends up being really hot and you start melting your plastic before you ever get it hot enough to draw in. So that just works really slick. Now the solder attracts to the heat, as well as to itself. So that's why I've got the heat on the bottom and I'm drawing it into the wire through the top. Okay, and so there we've got that solder in there nice. All right, so I'm going to move my hands. Hopefully that clears up a little bit in the picture. And so that's what we get. A nice solder joint. Try and get it clear for you there. Okay, so we can see that that solder is sucked right inside there and we get a good strong connection. Okay, now it can be a little bit brittle, so if you are doing a repair, say like on a door, we've got that sort of rubber casing where all the wires go through the door to get into the window switches and things. That's a common spot where the wires do this and end up breaking. So you didn't want to solder right in there because then you'd have this brittle thing that would break. So typically you want to run new wire through and have your solder joint somewhere where they don't have to be flexible. So that's really the only downside. But now we've got this solder melted on here and in and around the wire, but it's still a conductor. So we have to take and seal that up. And so now our best thing to use is heat shrink. This is a double-walled heat shrink, so it's nice and thick, and it's glue-filled. So it actually fills it full of a glue and just completely seals out that connection from any moisture and dirt and damage. So I'm just going to take and use a heat gun here. You can use open flame, you can use a lighter or something and just hold it away. But if you get too close, it does burn and it gets brittle. So if you have a heat gun, it's better. Okay, so we heated that just enough. You could start to see that glue push out on the ends just a little bit there. So we know we melted that glue. So there is absolutely no moisture getting in that connection. Now it takes a little bit longer than a quick butt connector. So time is not on your side, but it's also going to last a lot longer. And especially if you're in an automotive situation, you're exposed to lots of moisture, same as a marine application. So you want to make sure that you do that. A lot of people think inside the cab is fine to just do crimp connections and butt connectors, but there's a lot of moisture in the cab, especially in the winter with melting snow, with the heat in your cab and the snow on their floor. Often there's lots of humidity in there. So by far this is your best connection, and that's how you do a butt joint. Now, similarly, if we were going to do a T-joint, okay, we could take and strip two wires. I'm just going to cut some here. I won't actually solder this, but I'll just show you how to twist this together. So if we were connecting wires together, where we have, say we're building a wiring harness and installing a light bar or something like that, and so we have a parallel circuit and we got one wire coming in and then we want to go off like this, we can do it two ways. We could have left this wire together and not cut it. Okay, so imagine that was together. We could just not cut it, kind of open the wire up a bit, poke this through it, close it, and twist it around, and then you just have to be able to slide your heat shrink on from the end. But if we're going into sort of an existing wire and we've rated it to see that it can handle the current and all those sort of safety things, the easiest thing to do is to take and cut these wires. So let's say we're putting another trailer connection on the back of a truck so that you can have a connection in the back of your box or something, right? So you would cut the existing wire, you get two pieces like this, and then you want to tee in a third. So what you want to do is think about which way this runs. So if it's running in this direction, we want to lay it down in that direction so that it's side by side. Okay, and then we still do the same thing. We twist it like this, get that good mechanical connection, okay, get a good solid twist, and then it kind of ends up looking like one solid wire. Okay, now I would straighten that out before I solder it so I don't get a bend and a kink in there. Okay, and I get sort of what looks like a solid wire. So then when my heat shrink melts on here, it can fill up in here. What you don't want is to twist it on here like this and have this up like that and then solder it, because then you get this big brittle thing and you can't get your heat shrink in, right? You don't want to have it teed in like this, Okay, even though that looks like it, oh yeah, it's a nice 90-degree angle, you can't get heat shrink on there. So I always want to lay it down, right? And when I said in the direction it's going to travel, if the light's over here somewhere, right, I want this wire to flow in that direction. If the light was over here and I laid it down like this and I got to bend it around like that, right, then it opens up the heat shrink and can let stuff in. So you always want to lay it down in the direction that it happens and then solder it like normal. There are other quick splice things for making T connections, which are absolute garbage. I don't know if you've seen them. They're like little plastic things that lay down beside two wires, and then they fold in and they crimp a little blade inside there with 3 tabs, and it cuts these little pieces and it cuts in and makes contact. But what it actually is doing is it's cutting into the wire, cutting a few, and aside from being a spot where lots of moisture comes in, it's just these little cut wires that are butting against that blade, and that's, you know, really just making a poor connection and a spot where heat can happen. So I've seen lots of vehicles come in where those are melted and the cause of starting little fires. So they are absolute garbage. They come with a lot of light bars and things like that, and you should just throw them away and solder and heat shrink properly. And that's it for that little demo.